It was a busy afternoon at a popular downtown martial arts expo. The air buzzed with excitement. Enthusiasts snapping photos, students practicing moves, and fans lining up for autographs. Among the crowd, one man moved with a swagger that drew attention for all the wrong reasons. Steven Seagal, dressed in his trademark black outfit, sunglasses perched on his nose, he walked through the venue like he owned the place, casting condescending glances at everyone around him. Seagal had a reputation for arrogance, and today, it seemed he was determined to prove it. He leaned casually against a railing, talking loudly about his achievements, dismissing anyone who dared to make eye contact. Fans shifted uneasily, sensing tension, but most stayed back, not wanting to get caught in whatever he might do next. Then, without a hint of drama, Chuck Norris entered. Calm, composed, unassuming. He wasn't looking for attention, but his presence immediately altered the energy in the room. People instinctively noticed the difference, a quiet, commanding confidence that needed no words, no flashy moves, no dramatics. Chuck's steps were measured, his eyes scanning the room, and then, finally, resting on Seagal. The contrast was striking. Where Seagal exuded arrogance, Chuck exuded respect. Where Seagal sought attention, Chuck demanded none. The tension became almost tangible, like a silent storm about to break. Bystanders instinctively leaned in, sensing that something unforgettable was about to happen, though no one could predict how it would unfold. Seagal, unaware of the man he was standing in front of, continued his boastful commentary, attempting to dominate the space with loud claims about his skills and fame. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Chuck said nothing, smiled faintly, and let Seagal's words hang in the air like an overinflated balloon. And then, just as the audience began to wonder if Chuck would respond at all, he did. Not with anger, not with aggression, but with a calm, effortless gesture that immediately drew every eye in the room toward him. The moment was electric. What happens next left everyone standing there speechless. Every person in that hall instinctively knew. This encounter wouldn't end like any other. Something was about to change. And whoever thought they understood either Chuck Norris or Steven Seagal had no idea what they were about to witness. The room was thick with tension. Steven Seagal continued to boast loudly, his voice echoing across the expo hall. "I've trained with the best. Nobody comes close to me," he declared, smirking at a group of younger martial artists who had nervously stopped their practice to watch. He pointed a finger at a young competitor, saying, "You call that a punch? That's nothing compared to what I can do." The room was uneasy. Some admired his confidence, but most could sense the arrogance tipping over into something uncomfortable. Meanwhile, Chuck Norris moved calmly through the crowd. His eyes scanned the room, but he never rushed, never raised his voice. Every step he took seemed deliberate, measured, like a force of nature that didn't need to announce itself to be recognized. Those who had heard stories about Chuck, of his legendary skill, his undefeated record, and his calm, yet commanding presence, felt a shiver of anticipation. They knew something was about to happen. Seagal finally noticed Chuck. He stopped mid-sentence, narrowing his eyes. "Who's this guy?" he muttered under his breath. The crowd fell silent. Even Seagal's closest entourage could sense the shift in energy. Chuck Norris wasn't just another visitor. He carried an aura that demanded respect without a single word. Seagal, fueled by ego and habit, tried to assert dominance immediately. "You new here? Don't get in my way," he said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. He squared his shoulders, attempting to loom over Chuck. But Chuck didn't flinch. He didn't even move. He simply smiled faintly and tilted his head, as if he were observing a puzzle more than a man. The tension was palpable. Bystanders began whispering to each other. "Is that Chuck Norris?" Some pulled out phones recording the encounter. The crowd instinctively sensed a clash of legends was about to unfold. Every eye in the hall was locked on the two men, one brimming with arrogance, the other calm, silent, and seemingly untouchable. Seagal decided to make a move. He attempted a flashy demonstration, a high kick aimed to impress and intimidate. The move, while technically sound, lacked subtlety. The audience expected Chuck to react, to counter, to make a statement. But Chuck remained motionless. He didn't engage. He simply watched. The crowd held its collective breath. And then, as if reading Seagal's overconfidence like an open book, Chuck responded, not with force, but with finesse. A subtle step, a slight shift in stance, and Seagal's kick, which had been meant to dominate, landed harmlessly against empty space. The crowd gasped. The arrogance in Seagal's eyes faltered for the first time. Chuck's calm, effortless presence was a mental trap. The audience could feel it. He didn't need to fight. He didn't need to humiliate. The control was already his. Every small movement, every tiny reaction communicated strength, skill, and confidence. Seagal's frustration grew, but he couldn't put a finger on it. The harder he tried to assert dominance, the more the room seemed to slip out of his control. Bystanders leaned closer to their phones, recording every second. Whispers spread like wildfire. He's not just watching, he's controlling the situation. Some laughed nervously. Others were silent, sensing the psychological pressure mounting on Seagal. Chuck's calmness wasn't passive. It was active, dominant, and utterly humiliating, a masterclass in presence and poise. At this point, it became more than a demonstration of skill. It was a lesson in mental composure. Every viewer, every bystander could feel the power shift. Seagal, who had entered the room commanding attention, was now on the defensive, emotionally, mentally, and socially. The crowd could sense the change. The so-called master of martial arts was being outclassed without a single blow landed against him. And then Chuck spoke. Not harshly, not insultingly, but with authority that carried weight beyond the room. Skill isn't just about flashy moves or loud words. It's about control, respect, and knowing when to act. The audience erupted in murmurs. Some clapped softly, others leaned in to capture every word. Seagal's face tightened. For the first time, he realized that his overconfidence had left him exposed, not physically, but mentally. Where are you watching this story from? Which country or city? Comment below, and let's see how far Chuck's lesson has traveled. The psychological trap was complete. Chuck Norris hadn't thrown a punch, hadn't shouted, and hadn't humiliated Seagal directly. But every person in the room knew who was in control. Every bystander, every viewer on a phone recording the moment, could feel the tension, the dominance, and the impending moment of regret that Seagal was about to experience. The stage was set. The crowd leaned in, fully aware that what came next could become legendary, not because of physical combat, but because of mental dominance and flawless presence. And in that quiet, tense moment, the air practically whispered, Seagal has no idea what's coming. The atmosphere in the expo hall had shifted. What had started as casual admiration and mild curiosity had now turned into a charged anticipation. Every bystander, every fan with a phone in hand, sensed that something monumental was unfolding. Steven Seagal, emboldened by his own arrogance, had misread the room. He thought the quiet man approaching him, Chuck Norris, was just another observer, someone to dismiss with a wave or a condescending remark. But Chuck's presence was magnetic. His calmness wasn't passive. It radiated authority. He didn't need to boast or flex. His every movement, every glance, conveyed a confidence that could unsettle even the most arrogant. Seagal, fueled by pride and habit, decided it was time to assert dominance. Do you even know who I am? Seagal barked, his voice a mix of irritation and bravado. The words were loud, intended to intimidate Chuck and regain control of the room. He stepped forward, attempting a flashy sidekick that would showcase his agility and martial prowess. His entourage held their breath, expecting a dramatic spectacle that would cement Seagal's superiority in front of the crowd. Chuck didn't flinch, not even slightly. He shifted his stance, eyes fixed calmly on Seagal, and let the move come. And then, with effortless precision, he sidestepped, not aggressively, not in anger, just subtly enough that Seagal's kick landed on empty space. The collective gasp from the crowd was immediate. Phones recorded every second. Whispers ran like wildfire. Did he just dodge that without even moving? Seagal's smirk faltered. His ego, once towering, began to tremble. The humiliation was subtle, but it was undeniable. Chuck's calm observation had revealed the flaws in Seagal's attempt to dominate, and he hadn't even raised his voice. But Seagal wasn't ready to concede. He attempted another flashy move, this time a spinning kick, faster and more exaggerated, aimed not just at Chuck, but at proving to the room that he was still in control. The audience leaned forward, sensing that the mental battle was just beginning. Chuck, with the same composed demeanor, countered with a shift in stance and a slight angle that neutralized Seagal's motion without a trace of effort. The crowd erupted in quiet amazement. Some held their phones steady, some whispered excitedly, and others just stared, unable to believe what they were witnessing. The psychological trap was now fully set. Chuck wasn't engaging in physical confrontation. He was teaching a lesson in humility, patience, and mental control. Seagal's attempts to dominate were futile, and every failed move chipped away at his confidence. Sweat began forming on Seagal's brow, not from exertion, but from frustration. The audience could feel the shift. The arrogant master was being outclassed in presence, not brute force. Chuck finally spoke, his voice calm but filled with authority. True skill isn't about showing off moves or demanding attention. It's about control, awareness, and respect. The words landed like a thunderclap. Seagal's face tightened. Every member of the audience could see it. The mental advantage had shifted completely. The man who had walked in thinking he could dominate anyone in the room was now being subtly humiliated without Chuck ever raising a hand in anger. Pause for a second. If you were watching this live, what would you do? Would you step in, stay calm, or walk away? Comment your answer below. The audience, mentally trapped in the tension, couldn't look away. Every subtle gesture, every movement, every controlled breath from Chuck Norris became a lesson in authority. Seagal's frustration grew, but he had no outlet. He tried to make another aggressive step, another loud remark, but the room had shifted allegiance. Every whisper, every glance, every recording pointed to one undeniable truth. Chuck was in control. Even Seagal's entourage began to murmur nervously. The young martial artists who had once admired him now watched him falter. The subtle humiliation wasn't over yet, but it was happening, silently, psychologically, and emotionally. Chuck's calm demeanor was a mirror, reflecting Seagal's arrogance back at him and breaking it apart piece by piece. By the end of the encounter, the crowd was leaning forward in anticipation. They knew that the next move, the next word, could be the tipping point, the moment when Seagal would either recover or collapse under the weight of his own ego. And everyone instinctively knew. With Chuck Norris, the outcome was inevitable. The stage was set for the next phase, the public realization of dominance and the humiliation that would leave Seagal speechless. The tension had reached its peak, and the audience was fully invested, mentally, emotionally, and even physically leaning toward the unfolding drama. The atmosphere in the expo hall was electric. What had started as curiosity had now transformed into a collective tension that gripped everyone in the room. Phones were raised, cameras ready, and eyes glued to the unfolding drama. Steven Seagal's confidence, once unshakable, was visibly faltering. Each time he tried to assert dominance, Chuck Norris responded with calm precision, not through aggression, but through the sheer weight of his presence. Seagal attempted another display, trying to regain control. He moved with deliberate force, spinning and striking with exaggerated gestures meant to intimidate both Chuck and the watching crowd. But Chuck remained unshaken. He sidestepped, countered subtly, and gave no reaction beyond a faint, almost teasing smile. The audience could feel the embarrassment radiating from Seagal. Every failed attempt, every misstep amplified the psychological pressure. Whispers began spreading through the crowd. Who is this guy? He's too calm, too skilled. People instinctively leaned closer, recording, trying to catch every detail. Chuck's presence was magnetic, his movements minimal but authoritative. It wasn't just skill, it was confidence, composure, and control, the kind that could dismantle ego without a single harsh word. Seagal's entourage noticed the shift. Nervous glances, slight stumbles, hushed murmurs. They realized the tables were turning. Seagal tried to reclaim attention, speaking louder, gesturing more aggressively. But with every over-exaggerated motion, Chuck's calm demeanor made the arrogance look childish. The contrast was impossible to ignore. People were now clearly aligning their attention with Chuck, recognizing the unspoken truth. Seagal was losing. Chuck's strategy wasn't to humiliate with strength. It was to humiliate with composure. His eyes locked on Seagal, not in anger, but in silent mastery. Every subtle step he took, every measured shift in stance, communicated dominance without needing to shout. The room was witnessing not a fight, but a lesson, a public display of skill, patience, and psychological superiority. Seagal's frustration began to show. Sweat glistened on his brow, and his movements became sharper, less fluid. The audience noticed the cracks in his confident facade. Every attempt to impress now appeared desperate. Every glance toward Chuck carried uncertainty. People started whispering, "He's humbling Seagal without even touching him." At this point, Chuck finally spoke, his voice low but firm. Strength isn't about who moves fastest or strikes hardest. It's about knowing when to act and when to let control speak for itself. The words cut through the tension like a knife. The audience leaned forward. Seagal's jaw tightened. His eyes darted around, seeking validation or support, but the room was united, not behind him, but behind Chuck. Every bystander felt the psychological weight of the moment. The humiliation wasn't loud or flashy. It was subtle, inescapable, and devastating. Bystanders began to whisper to one another, "I think he's realizing he can't win here." Some laughed nervously, some gasped quietly. The young martial artists who had admired Seagal moments earlier now exchanged glances of disbelief. The arrogant man in black had been completely outclassed, not with brute force, but with calm, controlled dominance. The crowd was now fully invested. They instinctively knew that what happened next could cement the moment as legendary. Chuck Norris had the entire room's attention, and Seagal's ego had no defense. Every second stretched, each movement magnified. And then, as the tension reached its peak, Chuck tilted his head slightly, a subtle smile playing on his lips. The look was calm, composed, and just enough to communicate. "You've underestimated me. And now everyone knows it." The audience leaned forward even more, holding their collective breath. Phones were raised higher, whispers grew louder, and even Seagal's own entourage seemed frozen in disbelief. It was clear, the next move would either humiliate Seagal fully or give him a final chance to salvage some dignity. But everyone in the room knew which way it was going to go. The stage was perfectly set for Part 5, the turning point where Chuck Norris would deliver a subtle but undeniable lesson, leaving Seagal humbled and the crowd in awe. The expo hall had become electric. I was glued to the scene unfolding at the center. What had started as a casual confrontation had now become a psychological showdown. Steven Seagal, who had entered the room with an unshakable air of confidence, was now visibly unsettled. His movements were sharp, tense, almost frantic, in stark contrast to Chuck Norris' calm, measured presence. Seagal attempted yet another flashy maneuver, a high kick combined with a sweeping spin, meant to demonstrate skill, dominance, and intimidation all at once. The crowd instinctively leaned back, fearing a collision or some dramatic spectacle. But Chuck didn't flinch. He simply shifted his stance, barely moving, yet completely neutralizing the attack. The kick landed harmlessly in empty air. The audience gasped collectively. Phones captured every detail, streaming live to thousands watching online. This wasn't about physical prowess anymore. It was about mental control. Chuck's presence had turned the situation into a lesson in humility and dominance without aggression. Every subtle step, every calm breath, communicated to Seagal and the audience alike. He was outmatched, not by brute force, but by unwavering composure. Seagal's frustration was palpable. His face reddened, jaw clenched, eyes darting nervously to the audience for support. The room, however, had shifted allegiance. Whispers and murmurs grew louder. Look at his calmness, he doesn't even need to touch him. Every person in the hall recognized that the tide had turned. Seagal's attempts at spectacle now seemed desperate, even foolish. Chuck Norris finally spoke, his voice low but carrying unmistakable authority. Skill isn't measured by who moves faster or louder. It's measured by control, patience, and respect. The words struck like a hammer. Every bystander felt the weight of them. Seagal's smirk faltered. His posture slackened ever so slightly. He realized, finally, that the battle wasn't about physical moves. It was about presence, composure, and mental strength, arenas where Chuck had long been the master. In an attempt to reclaim dominance, Seagal tried to talk over Chuck, boasting about his own achievements, attempting to command attention. But the audience, now fully invested, barely even listened. Chuck's calm aura had drawn their focus completely. Every subtle gesture Chuck made seemed to highlight Seagal's arrogance and lack of control. The effect was humiliating. Bystanders whispered to one another, "He's completely dismantling Seagal without even touching him." Some chuckled nervously, others stared in awe. Even Seagal's closest entourage began to sense the shift. The man who had seemed untouchable was now exposed, psychologically outmatched, and visibly frustrated. Chuck's approach was surgical. He didn't attack Seagal. He simply let the arrogance unravel itself in front of the entire room. Each failed move, each desperate attempt to impress, was amplified by the contrast with Chuck's effortless calm. The audience could almost feel Seagal's pride crumbling, moment by moment. Then Chuck took a subtle but decisive step, a simple shift, a small adjustment in stance, and spoke again. Confidence without control is nothing but noise. Respect comes from mastery, not bluster. The crowd erupted in murmurs, some clapping softly, some recording every second. The tension in Seagal's shoulders became impossible to ignore. He had been outclassed in the most subtle, unassuming, and devastating way imaginable, without a single aggressive strike, without shouting, without spectacle. The humiliation was complete, psychological, and very public. If you think Seagal is about to realize his mistake completely, comment respect below, and watch what happens next. By this point, the audience could see the inevitable. Seagal's ego had been dismantled. The whispers spread. He's learned it now. The lesson is clear. Chuck's calm, controlled presence had created an emotional trap from which Seagal could not escape. Every person watching, physically in a room or virtually online, felt the power of composure, patience, and true mastery. And the moment was not over. The next phase, Part 6, would reveal the public acknowledgement, the instant regret, and the cheering crowd, cementing Chuck's victory not with force, but with dignity and wisdom. The expo hall was completely silent, yet every heartbeat seemed amplified. The tension that had been building for minutes, hours in some fans' minds, finally reached its crescendo. Steven Seagal, who had entered the room with an aura of untouchable confidence, now stood frozen, the weight of Chuck Norris' presence pressing down on him like a physical force. The crowd had already picked a side. Chuck's calm authority had captured every eye, every ear, every phone recording the spectacle. Seagal attempted one final boast, a last-ditch effort to reclaim dominance. "You may think you're calm, but His voice faltered mid-sentence as Chuck's gaze met his. The intensity of Chuck's calm, measured stare didn't just meet Seagal's eyes. It seemed to look straight into his ego, dismantling it silently but irrevocably. The room collectively leaned in, sensing the shift that was about to tip the scale completely. Chuck didn't raise a hand. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. His reputation, his mastery, and his unwavering composure were enough to render Seagal powerless in front of the entire audience. Every person in the room felt the psychological weight. The man who had once boasted of unmatched skill was now humiliated without a single strike landing against him. The whispers started spreading like wildfire. "He's done it again." Chuck didn't even touch him. "Look at Seagal's face. He doesn't know what hit him." This is a masterclass in control. Phones captured every expression. Seagal's tightening jaw, the slight tremor in his hands, the desperate flickers of frustration across his eyes. The audience felt it all, every second of Seagal's mental unraveling. Chuck took a subtle step closer, just enough to draw attention, and finally spoke, his voice calm but loaded with authority. Respect is earned, not demanded. Confidence without humility is nothing but noise. The silence in the hall was deafening. Seagal's entourage avoided eye contact. Some fans laughed quietly, others gasped. Seagal's eyes darted to the audience, to the cameras, to anyone who might validate him. But there was no saving him. The public humiliation was complete. Chuck's calm mastery had transformed arrogance into regret in an instant. It was then that the first audible reaction rippled through the crowd. A murmur of approval, followed by applause, then cheers. Phones were lifted higher, capturing the moment as the audience celebrated Chuck's brilliance. The humiliation was no longer private. It was public, undeniable, and viral in potential. Everyone watching, whether in the room or online, could sense the lesson. Arrogance without humility is fragile, and composure is the ultimate power. Seagal's expression told the story. The man who had once projected confidence like armor now wore embarrassment like a cloak. He had underestimated Chuck Norris, misread the room, and overestimated his own dominance. The instant regret was clear. The moment Chuck moved, spoke, or even breathed, Seagal realized the true extent of his miscalculation. If you think Seagal finally learned his lesson today, type respect in the comments below. Let's see how many agree Chuck handled this perfectly. Chuck didn't gloat. He didn't celebrate. He stood tall, calm, and dignified, a living example of how skill, patience, and composure triumph over arrogance. The crowd admired not only his skill, but his integrity. Even those who had come to support Seagal found themselves respecting Chuck more profoundly than they had ever imagined. Bystanders, young martial artists, and fans alike began discussing the event in real time. This is a lesson we'll never forget. I've never seen someone handle arrogance with such calm mastery. Chuck Norris didn't even fight. He just humbled him. The psychological trap had been fully set. Viewers were mentally and emotionally hooked, compelled to share, comment, and replay the moment. By the end of Part 6, the expo hall had transformed. What had started as a simple confrontation had become a public lesson in humility, mastery, and respect. Seagal's regret was instant and visible. Chuck's victory was absolute, not through aggression or spectacle, but through patience, composure, and undeniable authority. And in that moment, every person watching, live or online, understood the universal truth Chuck had demonstrated. True mastery doesn't need to shout. It commands respect simply by being itself. The stage was now set for Part 7. The aftermath, viral spread, public reactions, and the final moral takeaway, leaving viewers inspired and emotionally satisfied. The tension that had gripped the expo hall for nearly an hour finally released in a wave of excitement, admiration, and awe. Chuck Norris stood calmly, composed, and dignified, while Steven Seagal retreated to the sidelines, visibly humbled. The psychological and emotional domination was complete. The audience, both in person and online through countless live streams, had witnessed a moment that would soon be remembered as a masterclass in humility, control, and presence. Phones were still raised, recording the aftermath. Clips of Chuck calmly countering Seagal's flamboyant moves were already going viral. Social media exploded with hashtags. Hashtag Chuck Norris dominates, hashtag respect over arrogance, and hashtag lesson in humility. Within minutes, the video had spread across multiple platforms, amassing millions of views, shares, and comments. People around the world were marveling at the psychological precision of Chuck's actions, the way he humiliated without anger, the way he asserted authority without aggression. Fans who had been present in the hall began posting their reactions. "I've never seen anything like this." Seagal thought he could dominate, but Chuck just dismantled him with calm and composure. This is why Chuck Norris is a legend. Not just for skill, but for integrity. The excitement was contagious. Online communities began analyzing every subtle movement, every glance, every word, as though they were witnessing history in the making. Seagal, meanwhile, was left to face the reality of the situation. His attempts to reclaim dominance had been futile. His ego, once untouchable, had been publicly humbled. Fans who had once admired him now viewed him differently. Not with hatred, but with a clear recognition that arrogance without respect can crumble instantly. The instant regret on his face was visible in the recordings, the kind of moment people would replay and discuss for days, weeks, even years. Chuck, however, did not gloat. He walked through the crowd, acknowledging fans with nods and calm smiles, maintaining his aura of dignity. He understood the deeper lesson of the encounter. True power isn't shown through aggression or loud boasts. It is shown through composure, patience, and unwavering confidence. The crowd followed him with admiration, and the recordings ensured that millions online felt the same respect. By the end of the day, the story had gone far beyond the expo hall. News outlets picked up the clips, martial arts forums erupted in discussion, and social media influencers analyzed the encounter frame by frame. The lesson was clear to everyone. Arrogance can be dismantled subtly, and true mastery is as much mental as it is physical. Chuck's calm, dignified approach had created a viral moment that educated, inspired, and entertained simultaneously. Final moral takeaway. The encounter became more than a spectacle. It was a universal lesson. Strength without humility is fragile. Dominance without control is meaningless. And confidence without respect will always crumble when faced with true mastery. Chuck Norris had shown the world that victory is most powerful when it is delivered with dignity, patience, and intelligence. If you believe that respect, humility, and composure are true power, type respect in the comments below. Share this story and subscribe for more legendary moments that inspire, teach, and entertain. As the crowd dispersed, whispers of admiration continued. People shared their favorite moments, replayed the recordings, and marveled at the silent, unstoppable dominance Chuck had displayed. Seagal's defeat was clear, but more importantly, the lesson had reached millions worldwide. You don't need to humiliate to win. You need to control yourself, stay calm, and let integrity speak louder than arrogance. And somewhere in the minds of everyone who watched, the mental image was permanent. The calm, composed Chuck Norris standing in the center of the room, having outclassed one of the most arrogant martial arts stars in history, with no violence, just presence, skill, and unshakable confidence.